Şuraya. Tamam siz. Tamam. Hello everyone. Today's our guest is Mr. Philippe Leclerc, and he is a representative of United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, and for Turkey since January 2021. He graduated in international law in Paris, and he served as a cultural attaché for the Embassy of France in Tirana, Albania, 1987 and 1988. He has been working for UNHCR since 1990 in various positions through the world. He served as an assistant chief of mission in Kabul, Afghanistan, 2002 and 2020, head of the stateless units within the Division of International Protection at UNHCR headquarters in Geneva between 2004-2008, and deputy representative in Damascus, Syria between 2008 and 2010. He also participated in many emergency missions to the field, the last of which was in Central African Republic from December 2013 to February 2014. He was the representative of United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in France and Monaco from November 2010 to November 2015. First of all, Mr. Leclerc, thank you very much for joining this lecture. We are really appreciate it. Due to COVID restriction, we allowed a limited amount of students to enter the conference hall, but we have a live YouTube broadcast right now, and they are watching us around 100 students. Around 100 students are watching us. For everyone, thank you very much and welcome. And I want to start with a question. I mean, you have been so many different positions, so many different duties at UNHCR, and you have one of the most experienced expert on this field, and we are facing one of the biggest refugee crisis or refugee migration, if you like, of the history. And since we have been talking all day, what do you think that Turkey is doing right now in the field, since you are actively monitoring this process? Can you little
what do?
What do you think about the activities that Turkey is doing right now about refugees and in the field right now, in the real field, since you can closely monitoring this process?
Well, indeed, thank you first for inviting me to have this session, this lesson, this exchange with you and the students, and your interest for the issue of refugees. And of course, it's not a surprise to have such a conversation in your university, in a country which is hosting what we say often, the largest refugee population in the world since 2016. We don't say it since 2011, because at the time there were other countries still hosting larger populations, but as the situation in Syria has continued to deteriorate over years after 2010, many Syrians have joined the territory of Turkey to flee and to search for protection, because what is associated to refugees is the fact that the state that they are coming from is not providing them national protection. Even in the definition of the Geneva Convention, often the state is the actor which is not only not providing national protection, but also persecuting them on the basis of a definition for political reasons, religious, belonging to a social group. So these are the reasons why we call people refugees.
Yes.
And if they are called refugees, it's also because you're referring to a very important movement of people in the last years. And indeed, since UNHCR was created 70 years ago, and that we have statistics, it's the highest number of refugees we have recorded since we exist. It may not mean that there has not been big refugee movements before, including under the League of Nations, for example, where the first protection regimes were developed, and actually, particularly in this region, because many of the people who were fleeing at that time, in the beginning of last century, were Russians, Armenians, others who benefited from specific protection regimes. So the Mediterranean and this region, including the Middle East as well, which is very close to Turkey, has had, for different reasons, many refugee movements, including one very well-known and not solved, the Palestinian one, which remains, with so many Palestinians still refugees after such a long time. But as you have said, and after a long introduction to your question, indeed we have a very large number of refugees for more than 10 years in Turkey. And what I have witnessed since I arrived in Turkey in January of this year, I have been traveling to the many provinces that are hosting far bigger numbers than many states in the world. Şanlıurfa, 400,000. Gaziantep, 450,000. Hatay, the same. Not to talk about Istanbul, where 1,200,000 of them are staying. So it is an extraordinary challenge that Turkey has taken up. And I say taken up because it's on a, of course, refugees flee. But if they have remained in Turkey, it's also because Turkey has exercised a very strong leadership in first dealing with the emergency situation, which was building camps, not bad camps, good camps, because often what you see on the news is people in very desperate situations. But Turkey, in the beginning of the conflict in Syria, has seen hundreds of thousands of Syrians, children, women, men, elderly, fleeing very quickly. And the first response was an emergency one. In many countries, the emergency response is the rule. So you have camps which stay there for 5, 10, 20, 25, 50 years. Sometimes in some countries, you are born in a refugee camp and you die in a refugee camp, which is obviously what you do not want. So Turkey, after this phase of emergency, has decided to have a harmonization program, national inclusion programs, which are adapted to refugees, meaning that refugees will not be treated separately. They will benefit from the services, access to education, access to health, access to livelihoods, that nationals benefit from. So what we see and continue to see is a very good example that Turkey is having in terms of including Syrians in their national systems rather than having separate ones. It doesn't mean that there are no challenges, and right now there are the consequences of COVID and the consequences of the deterioration of the economy in certain sector has led many refugees to pay a tribute to these developments. Of course, Turkish people are affected by COVID, but refugees are as well. The good thing is that Turkey is making sure that vaccinations are also provided to refugees. But what we observe in the field is that refugees have been disproportionately affected by the consequence of COVID. What we see in certain areas is that negative coping mechanisms are taking place to react to the low income that they are able to get, because with the COVID, many companies have closed. Unemployment is having an impact on them, both in the informal or in the formal sector. And because of that, many children are taken out of school by their parents to work informally, to contribute to the very difficult situation in which they are. The same situation we see as a negative coping mechanism is the fact that we observe that in some Syrian families, again, the age of marriage of girls is going down, which is a very clear indicator of a negative coping mechanism, that families do not have the basic means to live and are resorting to these very negative coping mechanisms. So that is why it's important to continue engaging in identifying vulnerable populations among the refugee population in the various provinces of Turkey, and making sure that they're assisted. But at the same time, that we gradually, I say we, because UNHCR is supporting the Turkish state and in implementing the policies it has decided to implement. But we need to, so both identify the vulnerable populations to respond to their needs, but again, more enabling the refugees to be autonomous, self-reliant. And this is one of the reasons we were here today in the Abdullah University, to look how much people who are living as refugees in Turkey and can adapt to the local environment, and in particular contribute to the society by working.
Yes.
We would rather prefer, of course, formally, but this requires in Turkey, particularly in the agricultural field, as we were discussing today, quite a lot of reform, I think, and to ensure that the agricultural sector can provide employment. I understand that there are big needs of manpower in the agricultural sector throughout the country, including in Kayseri, and that we need to ensure the availability of this manpower, which can be refugees, which can be migrants, again, so that people are not dependent on humanitarian assistance, particularly as they have stayed in Turkey for more than 10 years.
Yes. Thank you very much. Maybe I should have said it in the beginning, but most of our students are from different departments. So basically, they might be not familiar with the UNHCR activities and UNHCR collaboration with Turkish government. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that in order to inform our students about the field activities of UNHCR with the Turkish government, municipalities, NGOs, and so on.
Yeah. So UNHCR is an international organization which belongs to the United Nations family. It was created in December 1950, and the mandate of UNHCR is to protect refugees. I basically gave the definition of who is a refugee, and to find durable solutions. What are durable solutions for refugees is the first one, which is used to be said as the most preferred one, is to enable refugees to go back to their countries of origin. But for them to be able to go back to their countries of origin, the situation needs to be secure, sustainable, and that return needs to be voluntary. And as you know, most of the refugees living in Turkey are coming from Syria. Others are coming from Iraq, Afghanistan, and some other countries. What we see globally in the world is that the international community has more and more difficulties to prevent and solve in a durable fashion conflicts. This is why the number of refugees in the last 20 years has continued to rise. We often have situations which do not allow sustainable return. The situation in Iraq, for example, has improved, enabling Iraqis to return, but there are still some difficulties in some areas, in some provinces, and this is why many Iraqi refugees are still hesitating to return, even in a situation like Iraq. Of course, Syria is far more difficult as the political developments have not taken place, as insecurity is still there, as also the general public services of health and education in most of Syria are further deteriorating. So what UNHCR is doing in Turkey is an industrialized state, having developed legislation, a democracy, and a willingness very clearly affirmed by the Turkish state, from the president to the government, in ensuring that 4 million people, particularly Syrians, but also others who have registered as international protection applicants, can benefit from the protection of Turkey. So as it's a huge task to receive, and for more than 10 years, the largest refugee population in the world, even Turkey, with all its strength and will, needs also to be assisted. It's not that Turkey is asking for that assistance, it's Turkey is entitled to it if the responsibility sharing mechanism that should be in place at the international level was working. It is not working well. Recently, UNHCR has actually, there's a global refugee compact which has been accepted by almost all states in the world, and this is because the international refugee regime, which exists since 1951 through the Geneva Convention, foresees who is a refugee, what refugees are entitled to, what states who have ratified that convention should be doing, but it does not refer to any system of international responsibility sharing. There's a preamble in the Geneva Convention which refers to international cooperation, which is needed, but the Global Refugee Compact and the Global Refugee Forum, where President Erdogan and the President of Pakistan, as well as the two countries hosting the largest refugee population in the world, participated, many ministers, so that we can go beyond the convention. Of course, the convention has its place, but what is needed is this responsibility sharing. So more support should be provided by other states to Turkey. Financial aid, for example, the European Union, in sometimes a sensitive and debated relationship between Turkey and the EU, there is this support of 6 billion euros that is supposed to be provided to Turkey. Part of it has been provided, the rest is being discussed. I will not go into the modalities of that discussion, but there are other ways than financial aid to support Turkey and other countries hosting large refugee population. Resettlement, which is one of the 3 durable solutions. I mentioned voluntary repatriation. The other one is local integration, which often here is mentioned as harmonization, which is not going up to the full integration. It can, but for the time being, it's harmonization that Turkey is developing. And resettlement is a mechanism by which states will resettle refugees from a particular country, like Turkey, to the United States, Canada, Australia, the European Union, Latin American states, so that, for example, in UNHCR, one of the activities that you were asking is organizing the resettlement from Turkey to other states. So in 2022, we hope to be able to resettle 30,000 refugees from Turkey to other states, and we will do that, inshallah, over the years to come, if states continue to increase this resettlement quota. But 30,000 refugees for a population of 4 million, it's not really enough. So this whole, again, is very symbolic of what responsibility sharing is today, both in terms of financial assistance, in resettlement, but also what the Global Refugee Compact wanted to develop and is developing is more involvement of the whole global society, meaning the universities, the private sector, other international organizations, so that in view of the magnitude of the refugee problem, more attention, more cooperation at the international and at the regional level is developed so that responsible sharing works and is not just a word and an objective. So again, in Turkey, the support that UNHCR is providing is in particular to state institutions managing the migration. So within the Ministry of Interior, the Directorate General of Migration Management, in sharing expertise, developing its capacity to manage, including data, which we discussed today is very important. We also support the deployment of staff and of skills to the Ministry of Family and Social Services, engage with the Ministry of National Education for specific programs for refugee children to be associated, but also for children as well as their parents to learn Turkish language, because this is a key element of integration. And we work as well with municipalities. Some of them are hosting very large populations, and they are the segment of the administration which is often the closest to both Turkish citizens, of course, living in these cities, but also the refugees. And depending on some of them, more and more decide to have either directorates or sections dealing with migration and foreigners and refugees. What is important also is to ensure the refugee representation or discussion within the municipalities, so that refugees also have a voice, if not a vote. The vote only comes with citizenship, and most of the refugees who are living in Turkey are not naturalized as Turkish citizens. Around 180,000 of them have been naturalized in the last years, many of them needing to show a good capacity to speak Turkish. This is why among, for example, the Syrians, you have a higher proportion of Turkmen population, because they have some elements of Turkish already. So again, there are many ways by which UNHCR can be either a direct material supporter of ministries, but often can be a catalyst so that more solutions are found at the various levels, be it national, provincial, municipal, and also engaging as much as possible with the refugee community itself, so that we deal with the people and we ensure that their voices are heard, including also the many activities we do with the DGMM at the provincial level, meeting with the muhtars, the imams, and the refugees, so that we are as close as possible and we fight against misperceptions that refugees may have regarding the Turkish society, and the same of the Turkish society having towards refugees. And again, then there will be towards Syrians, Afghans, Iraqis, misperceptions, but also from these same communities, misperceptions among them about Turkey, the Turkish society. So again, we see ourselves as enabling that dialogue, and hopefully soon we will not need to be that much here, because this dialogue will take place even more naturally than it is right now. Of course, just one issue perhaps which is of concern to us is that with the anxiety of many societies, including in Turkey, that they would possibly face additional influx of people, like the situation in Afghanistan is a very troubling one. It's first troubling the Afghans themselves, because they are the first victims of the instability of the country, just facing the winter coming, not being able to be fed, and so on. So all the support that can be done will be in Afghanistan itself, in the neighboring countries as well, But we have seen that the issue of refugees and migrants can be politicized, also because it's a concern of the people. But again, such concerns, if they are expressed in a only anxious way, usually do not provide the right solutions. And it's important to look at the solutions, to not to go for fast solutions, which we would like are possible, but with almost 4 million people, there are no easy solutions. It will take time. Many of the people will remain in the country, and hopefully voluntary repatriation conditions will hopefully be there for return to Syria. But again, right now we are not there.
Thank you very much. We have talked a little bit about the misconceptions and some other challenges, but there are also the opportunities that we have been talking since the beginning of today. And with all your experience and your active work life, if you look at that, what are the opportunities for both host communities and for the refugees? We don't have to talk about Turkey, of course, but in general, but of course in Turkey as well.
Yeah, of course, when you talk about refugees, there is an issue because most of the refugees had to flee their country because either of a war or persecution. So it's a tragedy for many of them who would like to stay in their country, but for various reasons cannot stay there. So there is a crisis, there is something which went wrong from the start, leading them to ask for protection that their state could not provide it to them. But that being said, many of the examples that we have seen in history, recent history, show that people adapt very well, also to, as long as they have basic conditions to live, that their life is protected, that they are not victims of racism, even that can be overcome. So, and we see, of course, that the children in particular adapt very well, as long as they are given the chance to do so, which is the case in Turkey for most of the children who are going to school. So, and this provides an opportunity, particularly when economies need to be developed further and that there is a need for manpower. And we have seen, for example, many of the OECD studies show today that in Europe there is a need for additional manpower, be it of low skill or high skill. The same studies should be further developed in Turkey and many other places to make sure that this possibility of employing both possibly skilled persons as well as youth who will have learned the Turkish language or the national language in which they are can contribute to the society hosting them. And many of these people who are coming from other countries where they cannot return from are willing, have an energy that I have seen in many contexts that will enable them to overcome the initial difficulties. So what we have to do in our different functions is to facilitate this connection between the culture of those receiving and those who are coming from different countries. And again, in Turkey, we see that there is this opportunity to further develop it. We discussed this afternoon with the Chamber of Commerce, the Chamber of Agriculture, the Chamber of Industry, the many difficulties and challenges also that exist, both with the complex legal system, depending on your nationality. But again, one has to look at the opportunities also that the fact that so many people are in this country, the youth, and the fact that many of them will be educated in the language of Turkey can bring to Turkey. So it should not only be seen as a burden, but indeed as opportunities. But also not being too idealistic. 4 million people, it's a high number of people. And again, I was mentioning the provinces which host sometimes 10, 15% of a population who are coming from another country. So there are opportunities. Our work, including with the university, the academic world, is to ensure that indeed this becomes more opportunities than a burden.
Thank you very much. I mean, we have been talking since the morning, so this time I want to give the opportunity to students to ask questions, because we can continue all day, probably.
All my life.
Yeah. But do you have any questions, or do you want to ask anything? Yes, please.
Sir, I'm Oğuzhan from Political Science and International Relations Department. Now, first of all, thank you for joining. My question about refugee problem. The refugee problem is global problem for us. How are other countries reacting to it? And then, are there any countries working this issue? Thank you.
Working this issue.
Yes, thank you.
Well, it is a global problem. Of course, it's a global problem for many years. It's first linked, of course, to basic either human rights violations in the countries of origin or conflict, if we talk about refugees. And I was mentioning before that the first aim of the international community and the United Nations is to ensure peace. But as I was mentioning, and the last 10 to 20 years have seen the multiplication of conflicts in the region. Further, no continent is spared. When you look at the refugee situation, the Middle East, Africa, Asia, Europe to a certain extent, Latin America with Venezuela. So the first duty is to go to the root causes, which is again prevention of conflict, implementation of rule of law, non-violation of human rights. This will enable far less refugees to become refugees and to be in need of international protection. So that's the root causes. But if indeed conflict and persecution and violations of human rights are taking place, at least the international community has not had this naivety of thinking that everything will go right, and has developed a derogatory legal regime, an extraordinary regime where it is foreseen that people will not be able to count on the protection of their own state. This is something which is important and which is not that natural to happen in between international relations, and it was also the consequence of the Second World War, and before the Second World War, all the movements that took place in Europe in particular, but also later on in various other countries, continents, with independence coming and the resistance to independence and so on. So this regime exists because it is required in certain circumstances. So some of the countries are working also on a more regional basis to try to react to specific movements of population in their areas. And so you have some regional mechanisms in Latin America, in Africa, in Europe, to try to deal more on a regional basis with the consequences of such movements. At the same time, as we see, for example, in a neighboring region, Europe, the European Union is facing extraordinary difficulties, even though states are relatively close and are supposed to act in a similar way, to finally elaborate what they call their pact on asylum and migration. where there are extremely strong divisions between states in particular which have not been hosting or used to host large refugee populations, like more from Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and others, and other who have had this tradition, both in terms of migration and in terms of asylum. And you see how difficult it is and how political it has become in the European Union to find solutions. So we see in the last years that quite a lot has been done on a regional basis to develop common systems, but we also see a lot of resistance in many countries because more nationalistic movements are also and sentiments are being developed in various parts of the world, which lead to many difficulties in finding common solutions. So that's why it is important, again, to develop this responsibility sharing mechanism, to try to elaborate it further on a regional level, but also at the global level. So a lot of work is necessary so that more solutions and more predictability in support if such situations arise, so that states do not have the reflex of closing their borders, putting walls, because this is now what we see in Europe, in Turkey, at the border with Iran, in Pakistan and Iran, not enabling people who would need international protection to cross borders. So we are at a time where even these key values that of protecting people in need of international protection and not sending them back to places where their life or freedom would be threatened is more and more eroded, and this is of concern for our organization.
Thank you very much. Any other questions?
First, I would also like to thank you for coming and participating us today. And I find this issue very interesting, and I also think that we all should be careful about when we are talking about refugees. And I believe you mentioned there are 4 million people who are refugees in our country, and many of them are children, and they could be vulnerable for any issue. And my question is, what else can we do for them? What can we give them to protect them from the issues like racism they could face? And another question is, when we talk about racism, it also happens in same cultural process. And what can we do for solving those racism problems as individuals and both for communities?
Well, thank you for these questions. I think both the children issue and how to fight against racist sentiments or attitudes. In my experience, a lot of racism is based on ignorance of the other community, of the other cultures, of misperceptions about who is the other, what is the other community. And the first way of fighting that is to give, well, first, objective also information about what is the situation. You know, one of the things we do when we work with the society in Turkey, we meet muhtars, imams, refugees, different people who have all kinds of perceptions of what refugees are or what the Turkish society is. And we need to dispel these myths by providing as correct information as possible, as what Syrians are entitled to and they're not, so that people do not believe that, you know, one of the common things is that Syrians are stealing my job. They are going to the beach when our soldiers are being killed in Syria. I mean, there are so many issues which are mentioned in the street, in sometimes the discussions that people have in their families. So objective information first is one way of dispelling some of these myths. And but who can provide that objective information? Do you believe in what is said at the TV? Are the journalists really providing the best information possible on these issues? So there's a lot of issue regarding as objective information as possible on the issue of refugees. So that's one way. The second way is to multiply as much as possible the contact between the cultures, the refugee and the hosting community. This goes in particular through schools. 700,000 Syrian refugee children are going to Turkish schools, which means that the children are in contact with other Turkish children, and that the parents of these children can, and hopefully, can also be in contact. So what we one of the best ways to avoid racism is, again, a better understanding between communities. So we have to maximize the willingness of both the refugees themselves to engage with the Turkish community and also the Turkish society to be willing to engage with their neighbors, with people who do not speak their language, because you can ask a child to relatively quickly speak Turkish. I'm not a child anymore. I'm here now for 9 months. Of course, I have a job, I have things to do, but for me it's more difficult to learn Turkish. And imagine some of the people who came and who have lost everything, including hope, and who are elderly and need to engage and learn a new language. So it's a lot of attention, it's a lot of sympathy also, and that has to be provided. And just talking and feeling accepted will make a lot to facilitate the dialogue and the feelings also of the refugees, if we call them like that. They don't always like to be called refugees because nobody likes to be called a refugee. You are an individual with rights and so on. So the less we remind them that they are refugees, the best it is as well. So again, engaging as much as possible. And for children, as you mentioned, the first thing is to ensure that the law of Turkey is applied and that children indeed go to school, that we fight as much as possible against the negative coping mechanisms that I was mentioning about child labor, early marriage, so this is, as an individual, as a student, as a parent of school children where you have refugee children, there are many ways individually that you can do which will fight against racism, enable better tolerance and interest between communities. So this is the type of ways I see the situation improving, and again, I see many marks of also contrary of racism in this society, where I have seen many youngsters, playing together, sports. I mean, there are so many ways by which people can live together and should be encouraged, and so that they are confident as well to go towards you, because for refugees it's not that easy for them to go to a sports club. There are many issues. So to be as welcoming as possible helps, and do not judge, if I may say as well, because often we are all judging, and often we are wrong in our judgment, and the reasons for which we see some behaviors are not the ones that we believe. So again, with more dialogue, more openness, and interest for the other, usually, and better objective information, things get better and even joyful.
Maybe I can add one more thing.
There was one person who wanted to asked a question as well.
Maybe one more way of supporting the communities are community centers such as Kızılay Community Center, which supported by UNHCR, and you can voluntarily work there, and you can we consider that as an elective course. In the school we have a voluntarily working course, and you can work in the Kızılay Community Center as an elective course. I also recommend my other friend. Okay. I also recommend my other students to consider officially supported NGOs and community center to work with refugees and other vulnerable populations. And yes, next question.
Thank you. Thank you for spending time. I want to ask about the conditions to call a community or person be a refugee, and can criminals be a refugee?
So, well, thank you for this question. This is part of the myth sometimes. So, a refugee, you have Article 1 of the Geneva Convention, so that's an international law, and you have laws in Turkey which organize the temporary protection for Syrians and the international protection for other nationalities. So basically, what Turkey has to do to first identify a person as a refugee is to consider whether this person is at risk of persecution in his or her state of origin on the basis of religion, politics, race, or belonging to a particular social group. If the DGMM found that a person who applies for international protection in Turkey is meeting this definition, then they are entitled to international protection, unless there are serious reasons to believe that they would have committed a serious crime, either a war crime or a very serious crime, and even though you would not have the proof of that crime, if information is in the possession of the state, which makes them believe that there are serious reasons to believe that this person has committed a crime, a serious crime, then this person should not benefit from the refugee status or international protection. So criminals are excluded from international protection, but not petty crime, or not sometimes also the persecution itself in some countries is linked to a condemnation by a tribunal, but the way the justice is rendered in that particular state is not seen as equal, just, and you cannot just consider the fact that a person has been condemned in another state if the conditions of justice are not well rendered, to say that a person will not benefit from international protection. But again, going back to your question, if you, and simply answering, if you are a criminal, you are not entitled to international protection.
Thank you very much for this clarification. And maybe two more questions. We have limited amount of time.
Thank you. My name is Promise, and I'm an architecture student. Thank you for coming. It's a nice opportunity to learn much more about the UNHCR activities in the country. I have two questions. One is about the resettlement discussions that you mentioned, and another one is about the workforce labor for refugees. About resettlement, doesn't it, especially when you choose a place like a country in America, and it's a bit far, so doesn't it interrupt the goal of voluntary repatriation for the refugees, since they're going somewhere way further than the original country? And about the workforce labor, I was reading about the workforce laws, like it says that refugees also need a working permit to be able to join the workforce labor. So are there any active programs, or do you have do you give any assistance to the refugees to learn the language or to identify certain jobs in the market in order not to create problems, as some employers who offer the job to the refugees just because they're gonna do the job for a much cheaper wage? Thank you.
Well, thank you for these questions. So on resettlement, as I said, it's a mechanism of responsibility sharing. Also, it's a protection tool that UNHCR has, offered by some countries. When a refugee, for various reasons, cannot have a favorable protection environment in the country of asylum where he or she is, or is particularly vulnerable, there are resettlement programs by certain states which offer places for resettlement. And there are not enough of these places. I was mentioning 30,000 possibly in Turkey as of next year, to mostly industrialized states who are willing to offer places for resettlement, often for single-headed women households, for example, particularly ill persons, or so these kind of resettlement programs that UNHCR is supporting with resettlement states. So obviously not all refugees can benefit from resettlement. Not all refugees will be identified as meeting the vulnerable criteria, for example, for the US or for the Canadian program. And there's not enough places as well. So UNHCR is ensuring that the criteria of resettlement on the basis of vulnerability are met, and are doing interviews with refugees and then submitting their applications to these governments so that refugees can then go to these countries. Is it contradicting voluntary repatriation? We now live in a global world where it's relatively easy to travel, at least for some. And so if the conditions in the country of origin have changed drastically, voluntary repatriation can be organized from the US, even if it's going back to Afghanistan, hopefully in the future to Syria. What we see is that in many countries, after some time, people may, if the legislation authorizes it, become citizens of that country, which happens quite a lot in the US and Canada, for example. So the likelihood of particularly the generations, the children of the people who have resettled to those countries to return is indeed more limited. But again, this is the choice of the individual, and there is possibility to return, but it's true that in resettlement countries it often does not happen, even though it may. And just on, I will not go into a long response because we have to finish, but actually what we discussed today with the professors, the chambers of industry and commerce, is how the entitlement, which is foreseen by the law for international protection and refugees here to work, but is limited by province and quotas, can be maximized so that more refugees have the possibility of contributing to the society through employment. And indeed, language courses are one of the many tools which are developed for refugees to learn the language, because if you learn the language, that's a first entry point to be employed. There are many others, but language acquisition is a priority to have a chance to work.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leclerc. As I said before, Mr. Leclerc has a very tight schedule. Even though he separated this time for us, we are really appreciate for his contribution to our lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Teşekkürler. So, was it okay?